Welcome to this lecture, which we're absolutely delighted, part of the SSR Ideas series on COVID-19 and the economy. And today we're absolutely delighted to have with us Professor Giovanni Andrea Cornia. Many of you will have come across his work already. He has worked extensively on many issues related to inequality, related to health, related to the economics of the welfare of children. Most recently, he's been the professor of economics at the Department of Economics in the University of Florence, but he's also been many things before that. He was the director of the UN WIDER. He was the head of the UNICEF Office of Research at Innocenti in Florence. He's been the director of the Regional Institute of Economic Planning of Tuscany. He's been in many different he's worn many different hats, but we also know him as a great friend of the developing world who has worked extensively on trends in inequality in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also in parts of Asia, and as well as global trends, and looking at specifically the impact of economic policies on the conditions of the less privileged, the more disadvantaged, and children. Today, he has a very interesting presentation comparing the North and the South in terms of the response to COVID, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him. So, Andrea, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. This is a new area of research, which I started looking at just out of sheer curiosity. The numbers that they were giving from the Italian Central Statistical Office and the Ministry of Health, they didn't make sense to me. So I started trying to investigate. And when we did that, then I asked Richard Jolly and Francis Stewart, who are two former colleagues of mine, whether they were interested in joining in. And we wrote a first paper that is referenced there on the slide number 1. Which has been published as a discussion paper of the UNICEF Research Center in Florence. And by the way, this morning the Lancet opens up a number on malnutrition and COVID, and then the first paper they cite is this paper. So we are quite happy. So it is helping someone. Now, I think it is important to make a distinction between the impact in the North and in the South, because the causes are somewhat different. And the impact is either direct or indirect, and it is also in a way different. So we move to slide number 2. So let's just start from the North, and which of course I know better because I've been brought in unwillingly in this debate. Now, the impact in Europe is basically the same among the big countries. Some were affected before, like Italy, France, and Spain, and Germany, UK. Basically, they follow all the same pattern, with some thousand people affected more or less, but they all lost about 30,000 people. And as pointed out by the German Minister of Health, I mean, the German curve was following exactly the Italian curve with 10 days delay. Now, so then one can say, well, there is a common pattern. Well, yes and no, because if you look at within the countries, there is a huge regional variation within all of these developed countries. And now the second point is that I cannot use the model, which I will comment in a moment, to explain what happens in developing countries. And if we try to do that, actually we're missing the explanation. Now, there is a common point, however, that also in developing countries, and now developing countries for me means India, because Vikas helped me, and there are more data, more debate, and so on and so forth. Also in India, there is a huge regional variation. And so the point is that if in both Italy and India, we were able to have an impact like in Veneto in Italy or Kerala in India, actually we would have saved thousands and thousands of lives. So the question is, why the nation has such a high degree? So they are very different. Well, perhaps yes, but perhaps no. Or perhaps the difference is due to policy choices. So changes in policies could have, and this is my own conclusion, could have saved thousands of lives, certainly in Italy. Now, what are the determinants of infection in the north? One clearly is the age structure of the population. If you look at the data, well, in the advanced country, 5.3% of the people are over 80 years of age. And in Italy, 7.5%. So we are a country of old people. In developing countries, on average, 0.4. And in India, 1. And in Africa, 0.3. Now, the people over 80 years of age are much more fragile, and they are subject to premature death due to the virus. And so that is one characteristic typical of the industrialized country. The second one, and you can see it here, like in the next table, like when you look at the COVID-specific death rate among the 2029 is 0.1%. And you have to reach the 70 to 79 to have very large rate, 27, 40.8, and 40.8 for this one. Now, if you take in Italy, 84% of all deaths are due to people over 60 years of age. And so clearly is a problem which is not solved like you would do in another country with a different age structure of the population. Now, the interesting thing is that the lethality rate, I mean, which is the number of deaths due to COVID divided by the number of people tested and positive, is the highest is Belgium, and I have no idea why that is the case. But then France, Italy, UK, then I forgot to put in Spain. They are basically all the same, and even the Netherlands and Sweden. Then the difference is then the US. The US, we read every day that there is this huge increase in this, yes, but the US has 350 million people and Italy has 60. And India, 3.1%, but there might be undercounting. Now, the second variable is living arrangements. And this is something which I think is very important. In people living in close contact with others, and in the north, nursing homes, which are not equally important in all parts of Italy, or barracks, or ships, or convents, or slums are more likely to be affected by COVID because there is a closeness of an easier contact. Now, in Italy, what is the situation in Italy? Well, in Italy, with the decline of the three-generation family, the elderly live a few options. They live either at home with assistance of a carer, who is normally a woman from Eastern Europe or South Asia, other Sri Lankans or Romanians, or they have to go to nursing homes. Now, the nursing homes are far more common in Lombardy, in the richest part, where there is this idea, okay, you finish, you have a very active work life and so on, so forth, and put you in these nursing homes, which are quite nice. But basically, they entail that people, they share a lot of space. So basically, many of these nursing homes are private, and they are regulated by the state, but the state does not regulate. And I think that there is, in what I would say, a sort of age discrimination. In developing countries, we talk about women and children discrimination, but in the north is clearly, we clearly have an issue of age discrimination. And I think that because there is this mentality saying, well, people over 80, they will die one of these days in any case. So it's not important to give them a ventilator or to take good care of them because they're about to die in any case, which is not true. Because I think the average age is for the women 86, 87, for men 83, 84. So public policy has to change in that. And since I'm getting very old myself, that I have a personal interest that this will occur. The next slide, latitude and climate. Now, I think that if you look at the data, the COVID has increased much more in countries or areas comprise between the 20 and 40 degrees of latitude, which means basically temperate climates like Wuhan, Lombardy, New York, Madrid. So the virus does not seem to thrive in very warm climates, but that has to be tested. Now, and also the virus varies with the season. Now, in Italy now we are entering the hot season, and so in spring and summer one expects a decline in the infection rate, but again a rise again in the fall and winter. Next one again, and prior environmental condition, I mean contamination. There are many studies, many are inconclusive. But I think that is quite clear that there are, if you look at the map of CO2, SO2, and particulate density before COVID, I mean the Po Valley, which includes all Lombardy and it reaches even Bologna, basically environmental pollution is very high. And this is also a region where there is a higher incidence pre-COVID of chronic pulmonary diseases, including children in my own family. Now, the University of Bologna has found that the fine particulate that is produced by cars basically can act as a carrier of the virus, besides damaging your own lungs. Now, high urbanization and congestion and territorial mobility. This is quite an interesting thing, because if you go to Bombay, I don't know, it has 10 million, 15 million people. Now, Milan is a big city, but not so big, one or two, but is at the center of an area which is very highly urbanized. So 10, 20 kilometers from Milan, you have another town of, I don't know, 200,000 people. So high rates of urbanization, basically, they tend to increase contact between people and the diffusion of the virus. And since, as we said, the pattern of urbanization varies with the type of countries. I think that if you measure, let's say, the number of kilometers of roads and rail per square kilometers, actually this is very clear. Lombardy is there is almost no farmable land because they all built highways and this and that and that. Now, so what is wrong with that? Well, actually, they increase the contacts among people of different towns. And the proof of that is that the province of Sondrio is a very nice little place where there is a Rockefeller Foundation, among other things. It's only some kilometers away from Bergamo, Milano, and all that. The infection rate is very low. And if you ask the mayor, his reply is that it's very low because it's very difficult to reach. So high road and rail density is a factor. And finally, the healthcare approach followed, a centralized approach based on big hospital, limited use of smaller territorial hospitals. Many of them were closed. Oops, sorry. Okay. Many of them, my brother is a medical doctor in Bologna, and he says that in one region, in one part of Bologna, they closed 3 hospitals, 3 small to medium size, just to save money. And because the healthcare model was that basically you have to rely on highly specialized and very good hospitals. But that turns out to be wrong. And you have to try to catch the people when, at the beginning of the infection. And so that approach, I mean, basically means that you place people who are already very sick in this very highly centralized hospital, and these people stay there for 1 month more, and there is very little tracing of the people, so very little tracing of people who enter in contact with positive patient, and very little quarantine. Now, I think that vaccination now. Here, I apologize, there are still some glitches with the language. But in Italy, for instance, the flu vaccination among the people who are 70 years old is standard. And I think that there are very good reasons. Now, BCG, that I know is very much debated in India and other parts of the South, here is basically universal. So it's no longer even practiced because the TB, which this is against tuberculosis, TB has been basically eradicated. So vaccination, I think we have to look at it because it affects that. Now, Now, what is the alternative to the Lombardy model? Well, a decentralized approach, which makes use of all the territorial health facilities as first level hospital, second level healthcare facilities, greater use of home care of patients with mild symptoms, assisted teams of doctor, nurses, regular visits, and greater testing and tracing and isolation. So that is, and I think that there is a nice study done by the Ospedale Gemelli di Rome, which is a very nice and good hospital, basically compares Lombardy and some other region. And I picked up Veneto, which is in the north. It's not very far from Lombardy, but it's doing much better. Now, start from the inputs. The inputs mean intensive care units, beds for 100,000 people. In Veneto, there are 16.8, in Lombardy, less. Rate of saturation of these beds, well, 103, and here 36, which means they have spare capacity. Number of tests to find out if people are is twice as much and is twice as high in Veneto than in Lombardy. Now, mind you, Lombardy is not a poor region, so they have the money to do it. But now, the number of COVID cases per thousand is much higher here than here. Are these people different age structure? No, they're all the same. This is the approach to healthcare. Death incidence among the over 80s in Lombardy is extremely high, extremely high. This is terrible, to the point that they had to take many coffins out of the Lombardy to bring them to Piedmont and other regions because they wouldn't know where to bury them. I never heard of anything like that before. Only Russia in transition was doing something like that. Death among healthcare providers, well, extremely high. Now, what happens, so altogether, it's quite clear that Veneto is doing different things. Now, and why is it? Well, because we saw it. They use a decentralized approach to healthcare provision, which has not been followed in Lombardy. Only perhaps now they're starting. Now, is this model, are these 6 variables which I mentioned for the North relevant for the South? And I think that there are some protecting factors in a way. Well, the age structure, there is a very low proportion of very old people. So that this value does not cause a large increase in mortality. There are few elderly living in high-risk nursing homes. There is a hotter climate, again, except in urban areas where the problem is very large, environmental contamination is less. And population density, except in urban areas, is less, except for urban slums where, I don't know, the situation is far worse. So in a way, one could argue that the South has a lower rate of infection because the structure is like that, because living arrangements are different, warmer weathers, urban congestion is less, and so on and so forth. Now, aggravating factors, but in the South, you have also aggravating factors. Well, first of all, you have a weak healthcare system. Now, consider that in Italy or France or whatever, despite the problems, Italy lost 32,000 people. Can you imagine? 32,000. And Spain, France, all that, Britain even more. So this is like a huge shock. Now, varying rate of vaccination, including BCG. So actually may weaken the immune system of children and the overall population, particularly of children. Now, then the other thing is that the South is far more affected by the fall in incomes due to lockdown measures introduced in the North. Now, nobody knows exactly, but the EU will experience a decline in GDP per capita of around 8, 9, 10%. Which means that trade with the South, tourism, and this and that and the other will be much less, will be poorly affected. So this is a point, and then this is asymmetric, because if India does a lockdown, actually you don't feel the impact here. But if you do a lockdown here, like the one they did in Italy, 69 days of a very strict lockdown, you do affect, and then that countries should take notice of that. Then you have a weaker social assistance coverage. I mean, now you have Andrea and many other things, and there are about 900 million people in developing countries that are covered by some kind of conditional transfer, or transfers. And the other thing is that if this is true, people may be less affected by the disease itself, but more by loss of income, poverty, malnutrition, and stressful forced migration. And here I have to thank my friend Vikas that and then in Europe we do have the problem of migration, which is basically inward migration. But in India you have both. Yeah. the Keralites going to the Gulf and the Bihari going to Kerala. So Vikas has compiled this basically distressed death due to the pandemic. These are people that basically are doing forced migration, and these are very shocking data. These are not the old deaths. These are only people who are forced to migrate one way or another, and the cost, the friction is extremely high. Now, now, and this I already mentioned it, but the advanced countries should be well aware of the knock-on effects on developing countries of measures like the lockdown or all sorts of restrictions introduced to fight COVID. Now, but if I were a sort of a tough governor, member of government from the Netherlands, I would say, well, we are also victims and we have to defend ourselves against that. This is true, but if you if you implement measures which are not damaging India or Kenya, well, it's much better. So perhaps there should be an idea of compensation. And in Italy now there is one opportunity. So there was quite a large irregular labor force of 400,000 foreigners from all sorts of many parts, not from India, because the Indians, they come in, basically Punjabi, they come in and they are very much liked and well better paid. So these people are like exploited like Chicano agriculture in California. So now the present government is basically considering stabilizing them, which means that their own wage rate would also go up and their own remittances to their own countries would also. So now finally, that also in developing countries, health and social policy play an important role in moderating or exaggerating the impact of the current situation. And here with the papers that Vika sent me, I think we compare a little bit Maharastra and Kerala, where the impact can be moderated if the proper policies are adopted. Now, Maharastra is, I believe, the richest Indian state, a sort of Indian Lombardy, very large hospital infrastructure, less widespread primary healthcare services over territory, large increase in the number of cases, now 40,000 cases, especially in and around Mumbai. Hospitals were overwhelmed by this increase, very fast increase, and the central government basically accounts on the positive effect of state lockdown. But we see that the recovery rate among patients is not very high, and the number of COVID deaths has risen only in Maharashtra to 1,390. Now, I took these pictures, these numbers from Surajit Mazumdar, who has written an interesting paper on that, and also from two articles on The Guardian. Now, Kerala. Kerala is my darling country, my darling state in India, and I went there already in 1976. And the socially advanced state in India, run for decades by the Social Democratic Communist Party of India, Marxist. A long history of social democratic planning, basically, not Marxist, despite the name. Excellent social outcomes in literacy, in IMR, large outmigration to the Gulf states where the wages are high, a large immigration from UP, Bihar, and then. Now, the interesting thing is that there is, and I remember when I went already in 76, it was visible. There is a capillary primary healthcare infrastructure. As you could see, these little houses with the red cross on top. And the other interesting thing is that partly are private. and they are well coordinated by the state authorities in that sector. Now, Kerala follows fairly closely the WHO protocol, which is quite simple: test, trace, isolate, and support. And actually, this is done, and then there are interesting data on that. Now, there is the number of confirmed cases is 561. The number of deaths so far, at least in the last article that the Guardian mentioned, says there are still 4. Now, there are, I mean, not that everything is so rosy, because there is going to be a very large return of migrants from the Gulf states, which are very infected, and so on. So the government is preparing for this new shock, and there are thousands of people, and they've already set up all the hostels, hotels, and so they're already getting ready. So this is a case of very positive social planning that has not been followed everywhere in India and in Europe. Now, the other thing which I liked is that you see on our TV all these long lines of migrants in the north, I mean, in the northern part of India, walking home on the street or on the rail tracks and so on and so forth. And why? Because they have no more jobs, and they think that the villages, the family in the villages can provide some help. And this is not the case in Kerala, where all these people have been fed for 1.5 months, 3 meals a day, and then they're being returned to their own families with chartered trains. So that is, which means they protect their own people as well, any people. So, and how do they do all this testing, tracing, isolation? And basically, there is a large number of volunteers, which is part of the political tradition of this part of India, which is a very good political tradition, which Kerala is the Kerala model, was and is, I think, remains something to be looked at very carefully. Conclusions. Now, the determinants of COVID infection and its social costs vary quite a bit from north to south. The groups affected also vary a lot. Some of the causes are structural. Now, for instance, if Italy has a very high share of the elderly people, that will not change. Actually, it may increase further. So, can you change that? No, that is a variable which cannot be changed. But you can change the way they are being looked at and they are being attended. And will the family take responsibility for these elderly people? Unlikely, because the labor market. But the nursing homes where they are placed, they can be massively improved. There are many scandals now. The police is investigating some of these nursing homes, which operate on a contract with the Ministry of Health, and there's some of these private nursing homes. They didn't really perform what they should have done. I mean, they haven't really done what they should have done. So no masks, and so that these people are old, they're weak, and then and so not all of them, but there is quite a scandal. Now, another thing which is important is the approach to health delivery. I mean, it's quite clear that Veneto has done much better than Lombardy. And mind you, Veneto has had for many years a very similar political parties running, so center right. But this time they got it right, and then and unlike Lombardy, they've been much more practical, much more down to earth, and they've done many more tests, everything. Now, I think that another point which has to be emphasized is that in both the north and in the south, and particularly in the south, I would say, the indirect effects of the pandemic due to the lockdowns, the economic restrictions introduced to stop the circulation of the virus are as much important, or perhaps much more important, than those due to the virus. And in Italy, the unemployment subsidy, which covers millions of people, expires in September or October, and everybody expects a lot of social turbulence. I mean, in Italy, basically everybody is, including self-employed people, they get some money from the government, but I mean, that cannot last forever. And if you think that the minister of industry in France today declared that Renault, the car factory, will have to be probably closed because they can't support it. I mean, this gives you an idea of how deep is the economic recession, which has been triggered by the virus and the lockdown measures introduced to fight it. So that is the now. Now, in both Italy and India, there is a considerable interregional variation in health policies. Now, by the Italian constitution, the regions, and there are 21 of them, are those mandated with the delivery of healthcare services. So they don't follow all the same approach. No, there are some general guidelines, but then they choose. And I think that the same is with India. If I'm wrong, please correct me. And I think that if we had been able to convince all the Italian regions and all the Indian states to adopt nationwide policies like those followed in the two well-performing regions, we would have avoided thousands of deaths, thousands. So, and finally, I think that it is important to emphasize that, and this is a very complex problem, that the North has the right to protect itself and to introduce those measures like basically confinement, that until when a vaccine is discovered is the only way to stop the virus to spread. So, and then and they can go like, we are also victim of the virus, like people in the developing countries. But some of the measures introduced in the North perhaps are unavoidable, but they do tend to aggravate the situation in some developing countries. So if I were Mr. Gutierrez of the SecGen of the UN, I think I would propose to look at that at least in the poorest country, I mean, in some of these African countries, that it's not like India, they're far less developed. India is a structure, has many structures, unfortunately, not all like Kerala. But to consider a special program of assistance for the decline in resources, decline in foreign exchange earnings due to measures introduced by the North. And so I would like to stop here, saying that here the climate is still a climate, at least in Florence, of people are afraid. People are afraid because after 69 days of isolation, people know that if you go to a shop, everybody stays at least a meter or 2 meters away from you. Everybody wears a mask, and the government has already clearly indicated that now they're opening up a little bit. You can go to a restaurant now, but you have to be at least 2 meters away from the next table, and which means that many restaurants will not open. If they're small restaurants, they have no space. If you are at the beach, then you have that every umbrella where a family normally goes should be at least 5 meters from the next one. So one is, it is easy to expect to have an increase in prices. Coffee has already gone from €1 to €2, and which means impoverishment for some of the people and a difficult life. Now, my other brother, who is not one brother is a doctor, the other one is a lawyer. He says that his customers, who are normally big firms, they say that they expect a huge instability by September, October, when the unemployment subsidies, which are almost universal, they will end. So they are universal, but they're not forever. So let's see. Perhaps the vaccine if the vaccine comes quickly, perhaps things will be improved. But the economic consequences of COVID are in many countries, I would say particularly in India, or in as important or more important that those due to the disease itself. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was fantastic. Unfortunately, my camera has stopped working. I'm trying again, but it stopped working. Anyway, I'm going to keep. I will. I'm still here with you, and I hope you can hear me. But that was absolutely fascinating, and this comparison is something that I must say I had not thought about directly myself. But now that you're mentioning it, so many aspects of it become really quite interesting. Okay, in that case, may I request Vikas to ask the questions?
Okay. Now, there is the first question is, how does the pandemic affect the relationship of the countries in the north with the countries in the south? So, what is the relationship? What happens to the relationship between different countries, and in particular the north and the south?
Okay. Now I think that the first question to be asked is how does COVID affect the relation within the EU? That is the because now there are all these plans for for introducing a number of assistance plans. I mean, the EU has reacted in part favorably because it has suspended the Maastricht Agreement, and it will remain suspended for probably several more years. And then it has the IMF has introduced some funds that can help the recovery. So everybody turns out to be fully Keynesian. But the question is, in some cases, some countries like Italy, France, and Spain, which are important countries within the EU, they ask some of these funds are funds which have monies which are donated, not loaned, you know. And then there are countries like the Netherlands, number one, that I think for historical reasons, you know, the Netherlands was invaded 300 years ago by El Duca de Alba, by the Spanish. And there is a war, you know, in the 17th century, there's been a war between the Catholics and the Protestants. And I think you can see some of this coming up again. And there is some degree of mistrust in this southerner, and in the south, some degrees of distrust in this northerner that are, for us, they are blind, and they are blind. Because I mean, with GDP going down 10% and unemployment will skyrocket, EU will disappear. I mean, it's untenable. So it's better to give them some money as a gift. Then now with the countries outside of Europe, this is a major problem. Some people, they even talk about Italexit, which I mean, some people in the Italian political system, they talk about that. And if they come to power, they are much more willing to leave the EU. And then if Italy leaves the EU, there will be an earthquake, because we are so closely associated with, particularly with France and Germany. And we are very good friends with both of them. But then there are all these other small states. Then there are the Eastern European, like the Visegrad countries, that are afraid that they receive a lot of structural funds, and they are terrible people. I mean, basically, just to be quite frank, they receive a lot of money from Brussels, and the money is paid in by the other members to sort of avoid them, to modernize, etc., etc. But basically, they don't follow any other rule. They don't take one migrant. They don't want one black person in their own country. They are bloody fascist and racist. And many people have already mentioned that this fund should no longer be given to them. And they were brought into Europe too quickly, basically for fear that the Russian bear would then basically take them under their own sphere of influence. Now, the relation with the other countries is basically affected terribly as far as trade is concerned. Trade is, because now Italy is a very highly integrated economy, where the trade GDP must be over 50%. And of course, with France and Germany, basically, but also with India, with China, enormous trade with China. And that is, likely to decline, and basically to question the whole issue of globalization. And to tell you the truth, I'm not too sad about that, because this idea of the global value chain and this and that, labor moving people. So basically, there will be, in my view, a sort of a decline in the trade GDP ratio, which in many cases is desirable. And the big issue is what will happen to migration, because migration from the south to the north. Now, in Italy, which is one of the port of entry, together with Greece, there are people coming from the Balkans, via the Balkans, and Spain coming from Morocco. Basically, there is now this has declined because of the infection, but it will restart again. And particularly, there are 2 or 3 group of countries. One is Black Africa, but not all Black Africa, Western Black Africa. And if you go there, basically, these are not bad people, but I mean, it's not true that they're all dying of hunger. And no, these are people that just want to go to a country where the wages are higher. But you cannot do that on mass if there are millions. And then there are the people from the South continent, basically Bangladeshi, followed by Pakistani and Afghans. The Indians, no, here we have a good tradition of Indian migration for many, at least 3 decades, because the Punjabi are very good farmers. And nobody in Italy wants to do the getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to milk the cows. You know, and the Punjabis, they do it. And I think that, so how will we handle that in a situation in which the northern economies will have been very much impoverished? And this will last for not 1 year, not 2 years, 3 or 4 years. And so that is the thing. So can we expect a sort of a tightening of migration policies? I think is likely. This is my own perception. Then there is China. Italy's trade with China is enormous. Italy is the first Western European country signing the how they call it, the road and I mean, this basically this new trading route linking China to Europe, and then for cultural reasons and so on and so forth. So Italy in this debate between the US and China is very careful not to go against China, because the virus comes from there. Whether they've been made mistakes or not, I mean, that I'm not so sure. And then, mind you, my wife is from China, so I'm brainwashed every day, you know. So I think that if I try to summarize all that in one number, trade GDP ratio will go down quite a bit.
In fact, I was thinking you've spoken about the impact on economy. What do you think would be the impact in the politics in Italy? What would be the political fallout of this?
Yeah, that's very difficult to say, because now the right-wing governments basically have already increase their own share of the total votes, but this is largely because of migration and illegal migration. And so in Italy, France, Germany, everywhere, Spain, and not to speak of Greece and the Eastern European countries, the nationalist parties, which are right-wing parties, and some of them really very bad, undefensible, like the Hungarians, you know, or the Polish. They are racist people. They say things that they make you laugh. But now, how far will it go now? And one reaction will be, well, look, now we have all these big problems. Now come back in 2 years, perhaps, something like that. You know, but then it depends on the people running politics. In Italy, the prime minister, who was a former colleague of mine, is a professor of law at the University of Florence, has been doing very well, because he's been able to keep this country of crazy people like Italy altogether, and is able to tell the Dutch or whatever, saying that certain measures are not okay, say okay, now if this is what you want, we will go by ourselves. And so that is, if you had a normal guy from the left, it would have been not as efficient in doing that. Now, my general impression is that COVID has generated a great sense of humility, because we have artificial intelligence, all the rockets, and this and that and the other. But then we discovered that we don't really know what is blocking entire countries, and so so that is, and at the same time, fear. What I perceive here is a sense of fear. People are, here they felt quite secure, including in the healthcare. Florence has a wonderful central hospital that, and which is very good and free. Basically, is almost free. And so then there is a virus. Man, what is a virus? Man, is because we were not concerned by SARS. So to talk about viruses, we have to go back to a lot, 10, 15 years. So people have forgotten. And so the people here will vote for those who guarantee them that the problem will be solved as fairly soon, like those that are able to promise a vaccine, which is apparently now they say that Oxford and in fact in the company near Rome, they're already testing a large number. And I'm sure that in India you have a large pharmaceutical sector, and in China, and in the US. So I don't know. My doctor brother says, "Oh, don't get too excited. It will be perhaps by the end of the year, but not sooner." So my impression is that people are afraid, and anything which promises them protection, and even if it is the cost of illiberal measures, will receive support by the people.
Andrea, so there are a couple of questions on this Kerala and the comparative analysis that you had. So you mentioned one factor for success for Kerala was following WHO protocols, but US has been critical, and even in India, the Indian Council of Medical Research and WHO have different approaches. How do you see that? That is the different ways in which and the extent to which people are following WHO protocol. The second question is, are there reasons to think that there could be a second wave in both the north and the south? And again, will it be different between the north and the south? And could it be that the second wave is more severe in the south? A related question is, do you think COVID will turn out to be world's greatest equalizer?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because for the moment, the countries who are the most affected, beside Brazil, because Brazil is following a very strange policy. I mean, it's a passive policy by Bolsonaro, and I don't know if Bolsonaro will last, because the generals who are supporting him, together with the evangelical church, they have basically indicated that they don't want any coup d'etat. They want Brazil to continue on the road to democracy. And but beside that, the countries which have been most affected are basically in the south, in the north. And will mortality increase in the south? Well, I think it will, but I think there are also the age structure of the population, the weather, the climate, the distribution of the population between rural and urban, and so there might be some protecting factors that are important. But I looked casually at some of the growth projections. I think that the largest decline is in Europe. I mean, is Europe and perhaps the US. Now, the US, I mean, I don't know what in a country which is so rich, it has all those, it has the reserve currency, it has many good assets. Why it should be like that? Well, I mean, I don't know. But the my impression is that from what we know so far, China they has suffered much less. They have not announced yet their own 2020 GDP growth rate. Vietnam also, South Korea also, and I would be Japan, I think also. So the East Asians have been less affected by the pandemic, and therefore perhaps by the economic decline. And Europe has been terribly affected, terribly, because if you look at Italy, Germany, France, Spain, UK, they're very similar. Just the timing varies by 2-3 weeks, but same pattern. And then the idea that the government in Western European social democracies, the government has to help, which has been at the basis of our policies for, I don't know, since World War II. And this is deeply rooted. So you cannot go to one social group and say, oh, sorry, you don't have health insurance, then you have to pay. Sorry, you have no unemployment subsidies. So this will mean perhaps a heavier burden on the public finance and that's a higher interest rate and things like that. So the area which I see is most affected is not even the US, is Western Europe. Western Europe and then the US. I mean, you never know, but it looks like that the infection rate is slowing down, and they are way behind Italy or Germany or the UK, and and then what happens in Latin America? Again, it's not really is far worse than the South Asia, but not terrible. And I mean, think a country like Italy with the universal healthcare system, France universal healthcare system, losing more than 30,000 people in a few months. This is a very big shock. And then if we don't intervene, it will spread like crazy. So, and can we change that? Well, yes, a little bit with some of these policies which I mentioned, but some of the basic things. So in my model, quote unquote, there must be something else. Genetic, perhaps, I don't know. But that is very difficult to argue. Now, the first two questions you asked is, can you repeat them, the first two?
Yeah. So the one was about the following WHO protocol, and what's the sort of the differences across regions, across countries, also differences between national medical authorities and WHO in terms of the protocol. What do you think? How important is that?
Well, I think that I worked many years in UNICEF, and the WHO protocol is basically very similar to what we preached to developing countries when they had to deal with diarrhea, with malnutrition, with measles, with tuberculosis, and basically it's based on the primary healthcare approach developed by the WHO in the golden years, in the 80s. So in this case, it is adjusted to the present situation. And now, who decides about the policy approach? Not the government of Italy, but Veneto or Lombardy, because in this country, and I think in many other countries, like in Germany, the national authority who decides about healthcare is basically the region or the Länder in Germany. And there are some similarities, but in Italy, there is a huge difference. There is a huge difference between what you do in one region, what you do in another. And you cannot just say, no, do what I told you because I'm the Minister of Health. Because they take the Constitution and say, read here. The Constitution says that because of the whole idea of decentralization, etc., we have to implicate the people at the lower level, i.e. regions and perhaps even below provinces in policy making. And so that it takes quite a lot of moral suasion to convince all of them that they have to, basically, they have to test. Now, somebody is testing much more than, I don't know, 1 month ago. So it is, in a way, adjusting to the Veneto policy. And I hope that in India, some of the other states will follow the example of Kerala and the other good doers in the country. So the WHO protocol is basically right. And then the question is, do we have, I mean, judging from the result we see from regions that where this has been applied, and it has generated a slowdown in infection rates. Will it have to be changed? Well, I don't know, unless the vaccine comes, I don't really see other things, other measures that could be introduced. That is it. And the other question, what was it about?
It was about the second wave. Could there be a second wave, and could the second wave be stronger in the south?
Yeah, that's a good point. We hope not. We hope not. But I mean, it's amazing to look at some of the data in Italy. Italy has 21 regions, you know, and of these 21 regions, now for almost a month, 7 regions, not a single case, you know. And even today, even with the decline in infection rates and deaths, I mean, it's still quite high. You know, yesterday, I think that in Milan, there were, in the Milan region, there were 150 cases, new cases. And if you go to south of, let's say, Naples, more or less, and then Sardinia, for instance, wants to wants to develop his own trademark as a COVID-free region. No? So clearly, there is a lot of variance in infection rates and death rate, which are not captured by what I mentioned. Is it genetic? Is it the climate? I mean, you see, these are plausible conjectures which I have presented, and in some cases backed up by studies done by others. But it would be nice to build a very nice database and do a little bit of regression analysis to see if they are relevant, and what is the proportion of unexplained variance, which means that we still have to dig further and find other causes. But will there be a second wave? Well, this is what everybody says. They even have timed it. In when? Well, in October, November. Now the South. Now in Italy also there is this strange thing that many students from the South, like Puglia, you know, which is like the Magna Graecia, which was colonized by the Greeks. So people, they like that region a lot, but they go to study to Bologna, Milan, Torino, and then when the virus was announced, that they tried to go back to their own regions, but there were no more trains. The government suspended all the train traffic, and so now they're going now. So unless these people are like new carriers of the virus, then but we would see it already now. We would see the infection rate going up. Now, what is possible that it will happen is that, you know, many people, particularly the young guys here, they have this mania of aperitivo. They want to congregate. Perhaps they're very lonely. They want to meet in certain parts of Milan, in certain parts of they don't do anything wrong, but they don't wear masks and they drink a little bit, and they are very close to each other. and that is a source of contagion. That this is quite clear. So the government has already announced that if the contagion, which is now measured on a daily basis, keeps going up again or every day, they give you the data, then they will basically go back to where we were, which means that you cannot go out and mix with people, which is very tough on people. It's very tough because in my case, okay, I have a Jayati has been here. There is a big garden, and there are some people we meet, but very very few. And I can go out and walk up and down my garden. But if you live in a small apartment of 50 square meters, surrounded by 1,000 other apartments like that, to stay in isolation is quite difficult. So
Andrea,
my guess is that first of all, there is something else which is not captured by what we discussed today. Perhaps genetic that I'm
yeah,
not
but
able.
Andrea, one thing I was thinking of was, warm temperatures that you talked about. The evidence in India doesn't support that really. I mean, Mumbai is pretty warm. So is Rajasthan or even West Bengal or Kerala for that matter. I mean, so we've had fairly high spread of COVID infections in places which are quite warm.
Which are quite.
Which are quite warm.
Uh-huh.
I mean, April and May are very warm months in many parts of India. So I mean, the Indian evidence doesn't seem to support the. In fact, Indian policymakers were perhaps hoping that by the time it hits India, the weather is going to become warm and this might just die, the virus. But that clearly did not happen. And
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, so
perhaps.
yeah.
So if Jayati will send me a couple of JNU students, we will accommodate them and make them collect all this information, all the numbers, and then we test them.
Yeah, Jyoti, you should come live.
Yeah,
But,
I'm live. I'm here. I'm listening all along.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So,
yeah, well, I think there was one question also. I don't know whether Vikas you raised it about the lockdown as a containment strategy. I think that because here in India we are really concerned at what has happened through the lockdown and the damage it has done even to other health conditions. So it's worth examining whether your sense is that first of all how the lockdowns have differed in Italy versus here, and whether this is always the best kind of way of dealing with it, these very drastic and brutal lockdowns that damage people's livelihoods and also their health in other ways.
yeah. Now, what we wrote in the paper with Francis and Richard basically is that the lockdown in Italy has been the only way they could, because I mean there's been a night, what was it, the 19th of March or something like that. I mean the one day the number of people getting infected rose from, I don't know, 300 to 3,000. So this is when the government intervened very brutally. And this has been since then, and the infection rate has been stabilized and then declined. But I mean, the infection rate has been so high, particularly among the elderly, that they wouldn't know where to put all these dead people, all these coffins. So they started using churches, and they send in the army with army trucks to bring them to other regions because the cemeteries were closed because they had no space. And so it was quite a terrible situation. And when was it? In around mid March. I mean, you would see these columns of military trucks, and you couldn't see inside, but there were, each one of them had 8 or 10 of these coffins being brought to Piedmont and other parts of the region. So people that would say, okay, needs to be done. And as it brought it down, yes. As it brought it down quickly, well, I don't know. I mean, basically, if you look at the pattern in Western Europe, it's all the same. So they came down more or less at the same speed of Spain. Spain is the one which resembles the most Italy, and but the UK and Germany. Germany, the infection curve was exactly like the one in Italy with a delay of 10 days. But Germany is an interesting case because we don't understand everything of what has happened. They have exactly more or less the same number of infections, but the number of dead people is much less. It's like 1/5 or 1/4. And then the question, how is it? So it could be that when somebody is declared dead, it has to be signed by a medical doctor, and the doctor may decide to say, well, this one died of heart attack, even if it was a COVID. So it's an initial classification of the deaths. Otherwise, it looks like United Europe in that respect. So could have been done differently. It was spreading very, very fast, and even with the very tough, because this has been very tough here. If you wanted to go out, except for the supermarket and the pharmacy, you needed to fill a form explaining to the police who would stop you on the street what you were supposed to do. So if you have to go and see a doctor, you have to show the bookings and all that. And then again, I'm not a good example because I have a lot of space around me, but many people being going crazy, and so it could have been done differently. I'm unable to answer that, but what is amazing is that how unprepared we were. We Europeans have been caught. We were caught in a totally unprepared way. Nobody had enough respirators. Nobody has enough, even masks, which is the thing, with all the factories. Oh, yes, another point which is important, I didn't mention it. This is a situation in which basically all these things which are used to cure people, they have to be produced by state companies. If anything, the government should buy the companies having the ability to produce that. But you cannot say, okay, yeah, now we have ordered 10 million masks. Where are they produced? In Vietnam. It's crazy. In Italy, you can produce anything. In India, you can produce anything. So these are public goods. And this public goods, one normal solution, which is proposed by public economics, is the direct provision. So now we are much better prepared. But and I have my own political economy explanation of that. Because if you look at the curve, they are highly convex. So they start very slow, 10 cases, 20 cases. And so then the curve starts becoming much steeper at some point. And only when the curve is steeper, then the governments intervene. Because the government does not want to tell the restaurant, now you close up, and they say, no, you son of a bitch, you want us to lose money, and so on and so forth. And so the ability of the government to impose measures increases with the gravity of the problem. Everywhere has been the same. While if you had started, like in Kerala, early on, they were better prepared. And now they are prepared for the migrants coming back from the Gulf states. And this is almost unavoidable. But when in the early phases, even if you have the best doctors and the best virologists, the increases are very, very, very slow, because you double every 2 days, and then you double, and then at some point the doubling becomes convex, steep, and at that point governments intervene. But then the phenomenon is already underway. And then if you then decide to follow market rules, because we are a market economy, then I got to hell with the market economy. The government should be responsible for providing all that. And now in Italy, finally, I think they have nationalized one of these companies producing these things, but with months of delay. So the market is not able to coordinate demand and supply and information. And that is a very important point for all these public bets like pandemics and epidemics. That is.
Well, on that slightly somber note, Andrea, except that at least we get to see you virtually. Thank you so much. for this very, very fascinating lecture and very thought-provoking, and also for all of these very interesting responses to these questions, which are actually creating even more food for thought. It's really been great to have you. We're really happy that you agreed to do this. And I'm sure everybody who's listening has benefited a lot. I want to also thank everybody else on behalf of Ideas and SSER for attending this set of lectures. And I think it's been a wonderful way to conclude the series with Andrea's excellent presentation. So thank you so much, Andrea.